How to stay calm under psychological pressure. Master composure when it matters most. Pressure does not break you, it reveals you. Anyone can stay calm when nothing is at stake. But real strength is measured when decisions matter and emotions spike. In this audiobook, you will learn how to remain composed when others panic. Not through wishful thinking, through controlled psychological training. Introduction. You already know what pressure feels like. The tightness in your chest, the racing thoughts, the sudden inability to think clearly when you need it most. It happens in conversations that turn confrontational, in moments when you're being evaluated, in decisions that carry real consequences, in situations where your response will define how others see you. And in those moments, most people collapse internally. They don't fall apart visibly, but their thinking fractures, their composure cracks, and they react from emotion instead of intention. This is not weakness, this is biology. Your brain is designed to escalate threat, to prioritize survival over strategy, to flood your system with stress responses that override clear thinking. But that design can be trained. You can learn to interrupt the automatic escalation, to maintain cognitive control when your body is signaling danger, to think clearly when everyone around you is reacting. This book is not about suppressing emotions. It's not about pretending you don't feel pressure. It's about maintaining psychological composure while the pressure is present. Composure is not the absence of stress. It's controlled response under stress. It's the ability to feel the pressure and still think strategically, to notice your emotional state without being controlled by it, to stay deliberate when your instincts are screaming for reaction. Most people wait for pressure to decrease before they can think clearly, but pressure doesn't always decrease. Sometimes it increases, sometimes it sustains, and waiting for it to pass means you've already lost control. The alternative is training yourself to function within pressure, to use it, to sharpen under it instead of scattering. You will learn why your brain escalates threat beyond what the situation warrants, how emotional hijacking works at a neurological level, what social pressure does to your decision-making, and why most people fail under evaluation not because they lack competence but because they lack composure. You will learn how to slow your reaction cycle, how to control physiological stress responses in real time, how to reframe situations cognitively while they're unfolding, how to build internal stability that external chaos cannot destabilize. And you will learn how to apply this in high-stakes situations, in conflict without emotional collapse, under public scrutiny and social evaluation, and how to become the calmest person in the room not through performance but through trained control. Calm under pressure is not a personality trait. It's a rehearsed skill, and you're about to learn how to build it. Part I Understanding Pressure. Chapter 1. Why the Brain Escalates Threat. Your brain does not assess threat accurately, it overestimates, and it does this by design. From an evolutionary perspective, overestimating threat kept you alive. The ancestor who mistook a shadow for a predator survived. The ancestor who underestimated survived less often. So your brain inherited a bias toward escalation. When uncertain, it assumes danger. When detecting potential threat, it activates as if the threat is certain. This served you well when threats were physical and immediate. But in modern contexts, most pressure is psychological. It's social evaluation, performance scrutiny, conflict, reputation risk, decision-making under observation. And your brain responds to these situations with the same threat escalation it would use for physical danger. Even though the stakes are different, even though the appropriate response is different. Here's what happens neurologically. When your brain detects pressure, the amygdala activates. This is the threat detection center. It processes information faster than your conscious awareness. Before you fully understood the situation, your amygdala has already decided whether it's threatening. And if it decides yes, it triggers a cascade of stress responses: cortisol, adrenaline, increased heart rate, shallow breathing, muscle tension. And all of this happens before your prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for strategic thinking, has time to assess the situation logically. This is why you sometimes feel anxious before you know why. Your body is responding to a threat your conscious mind hasn't identified yet. The amygdala saw something, interpreted it as dangerous, and initiated the stress response. And once that response is active, it's hard to think clearly, because the stress response is designed to prioritize action over analysis. Fight or flight, not reflection. But the amygdala doesn't distinguish well between types of threat. A confrontation with a colleague activates the same system as a physical attack. Public speaking activates the same system as being chased. The intensity might differ, but the mechanism is the same. Your brain escalates, your body prepares for danger, and your thinking narrows. This narrowing is called perceptual tunneling. Under stress, your brain focuses on the perceived threat and filters out everything else. You lose peripheral awareness. You stop noticing subtleties. You default to rigid thinking. And in social or professional contexts, this is counterproductive, because the situations that create pressure are often complex. They require nuance. They require you to hold multiple perspectives, to think strategically. But stress response eliminates nuance. It simplifies everything into threat or safety, and it pushes you toward the fastest response, not the most effective one. Understanding this mechanism is the first step toward controlling it. Because once you recognize that your brain is escalating threat automatically, you can interrupt that escalation. You don't have to accept the threat assessment your amygdala provides. You can pause. You can engage your prefrontal cortex. You can assess the situation more accurately. This doesn't mean you ignore real threats. It means you don't let your brain's bias toward escalation dictate your response. You acknowledge the pressure. You feel the physiological activation. And then you choose how to respond. Not from automatic escalation, from controlled assessment. Most people never question their brain's threat response. They feel the pressure. They assume the pressure is proportional to the threat, and they react accordingly. But pressure is often disproportionate. Your brain's escalation is often excessive, and reacting to that excessive escalation leads to poor decisions. So the foundation of composure under pressure is recognizing that your brain escalates. It's biologically programmed to do so, and that escalation is not always accurate. Once you know this, you can train a different response, one that doesn't depend on your brain's automatic assessment, one that depends on your controlled intervention. Chapter 2: Emotional hijacking explained. Emotional hijacking is when your emotional response overrides your cognitive control. It's when you know logically what you should do, but your emotions drive you to do something else. This happens because emotions are processed faster than thoughts. Your emotional centers activate before your analytical centers have time to respond. And if the emotion is strong enough, it can completely dominate your decision-making. Not because you're weak, but because the neural pathway for emotion is faster and, under stress, stronger. Here's the sequence. Something happens. Your brain perceives it as threatening or significant. The amygdala activates. Emotional response floods your system. And your prefrontal cortex, which would normally moderate that response, gets suppressed. Not shut down completely, but significantly weakened. Its ability to regulate emotion, to think strategically, to delay gratification, all diminish under strong emotional activation. This is why you sometimes say things you regret in arguments. You knew better, but in the moment, your emotional system was in control, and the part of your brain that would have stopped you was offline. This is also why high-stakes decisions made under emotional pressure often feel right in the moment and wrong in retrospect. In the moment, your emotional system is convincing. It feels like clarity, it feels like certainty, but it's not. It's hijacking. Emotional hijacking is most common in situations that trigger strong feelings quickly. Conflict, criticism, public embarrassment, perceived injustice, threat to identity or status. In these situations, the emotional response is so fast and so strong that cognitive control doesn't have time to establish itself. You're reacting before you're thinking. And by the time you realize you're reacting, you've already acted. The key to preventing hijacking is recognizing the early signs, before the emotion fully takes over, before you've lost access to your prefrontal cortex. The early signs are physiological: increased heart rate, heat in your face, tension in your jaw or shoulders, faster breathing, a sense of urgency or intensity. These signs appear before the full hijacking, and if you catch them early, you can interrupt the process. The interruption is simple but requires practice. You pause. Physically, you stop whatever you're doing. You take a slow breath. You give your prefrontal cortex time to come online. This pause doesn't eliminate the emotion. It just prevents the emotion from dictating your response. It creates space between stimulus and reaction. And in that space, cognitive control can reestablish itself. But most people don't pause. They feel the intensity. They interpret it as urgency. And they act immediately, which is exactly what emotional hijacking wants. Immediate action, before analysis, before control. So the practice is counterinstinctual. You feel urgency, and instead of acting on it, you slow down. You feel intensity, and instead of expressing it, you observe it. This doesn't mean you never act on emotion. Sometimes emotional responses are appropriate. Sometimes intensity is justified. But hijacking removes choice. It makes you react. And reactions are often poorly calibrated. They're often excessive. They escalate situations unnecessarily. Pausing restores choice. You can still choose to act on the emotion. But it's a choice, not a hijacking. Another aspect of hijacking, it creates cognitive distortions. When you're emotionally hijacked, your perception changes. You see the situation through the lens of the emotion. If you're angry, everything looks like an attack. If you're anxious, everything looks like a threat. If you're embarrassed, everything feels like judgment. And these distortions feel real. They don't feel like distortions. They feel like accurate perceptions. But they're not. They're emotional interpretations. And acting on those interpretations often makes things worse. The antidote is recognizing when you're in a hijack state. And the clearest sign is intensity. If your emotional response feels disproportionately strong, you're likely hijacked. And in that state, you don't trust your perceptions. You don't trust your impulses. You pause. You wait. You let the intensity decrease before you make decisions. Emotional hijacking is not a flaw. It's a feature of how your brain is built. And understanding it gives you power over it. Because once you know hijacking is happening, you can choose not to act on it. You can wait. You can think. You can respond from composure instead of from intensity. Chapter 3: The Psychology of Social Pressure. Social pressure is psychological pressure that comes from being observed, evaluated, or judged by others, and it activates threat responses just as strongly as physical danger. For most of human history, social exclusion was life-threatening. Being rejected by your group meant reduced access to resources, protection, and reproduction, so your brain evolved to treat social threat as survival threat. And it still does. Even though social rejection is no longer life-threatening, your brain responds as if it is. This is why public speaking activates such intense anxiety. Why being criticized in front of others feels so destabilizing. Why performance under observation creates pressure far beyond the difficulty of the task itself. You're not just doing the task, you're being evaluated. And evaluation triggers ancient survival mechanisms. Social pressure operates through several mechanisms. The first is reputation management. You're constantly monitoring how others perceive you, and you're adjusting your behavior to maintain or improve that perception. This happens mostly unconsciously. You moderate your tone. You choose your words. You manage your expressions, all to control how you're seen. And under social pressure, this monitoring intensifies. You become hyper-aware of how you're coming across. And that hyper-awareness fragments your attention. Part of your mind is on the task. Part is on how you're being perceived. And that split drains cognitive resources. The second mechanism is conformity pressure. When in groups, your brain defaults toward aligning with group norms. This happens even when you consciously disagree. Under social pressure, this conformity instinct strengthens. You feel pulled toward saying what others expect, toward not standing out, toward avoiding conflict. And this pull can override your actual judgment. You know what you think, but you say something else. Because the pressure to conform feels stronger than the pressure to be accurate. The third mechanism is status threat. In any social context, there's an implicit hierarchy, and your brain is constantly tracking where you stand in that hierarchy. When you perceive your status being challenged or diminished, your brain treats it as a threat, and it activates stress responses, defensiveness, aggression, withdrawal. And under these responses, your thinking becomes rigid. You're no longer open to new information. You're just protecting your position. Social pressure also creates a specific cognitive distortion, the spotlight effect. You overestimate how much others are paying attention to you. In reality, most people are focused on themselves, on their own performance, their own concerns. But under social pressure, you feel like everyone is watching you intensely. And that feeling increases self-consciousness, which increases anxiety, which impairs performance, which makes you more self-conscious. A feedback loop. The antidote to social pressure is not eliminating the pressure. It's decoupling your performance from your self-worth. Most social pressure is internalized. You feel it because you've connected your performance to your identity. If you perform well, you're competent. If you perform poorly, you're inadequate. But performance is not identity, it's just performance. One instance, one moment, not a referendum on your worth. When you decouple these, social pressure loses its intensity. You still care about performing well, but the stakes feel different. Failure is not identity collapse. It's just a poor performance. And that shift changes everything, because now you're not protecting your identity. You're just executing a task. Another tool, reframing observation. Instead of seeing being watched as threatening, see it as neutral. People are observing. That's all. They're not inherently judging. They're just seeing. And even if they are judging, their judgment doesn't define you. It's just their perspective, and perspectives are variable. Social pressure also diminishes when you focus externally instead of internally. Instead of monitoring how you're coming across, focus on the task, on the conversation, on the information. Redirect your attention away from self-monitoring and place it on execution. This doesn't eliminate social pressure, but it reduces the cognitive load. You're no longer splitting attention between performance and self-evaluation. You're just performing. The final point, social pressure is cumulative. One instance of evaluation doesn't create overwhelming pressure. But repeated evaluation, sustained observation, chronic social scrutiny, these accumulate. And under cumulative pressure, your stress responses remain chronically elevated. You never fully recover, and that chronic activation degrades composure over time. So managing social pressure also requires managing recovery. Periods where you're not being evaluated, where you can drop the self-monitoring, where you can rest your social cognition. Social pressure is real, it's powerful, and it's not going away. But understanding its mechanisms gives you control over your response. You can recognize when your brain is escalating social threat. You can decouple performance from identity. You can redirect attention externally. And you can maintain composure even when being observed. Part 3, Composure Training. Chapter 4. Slowing the reaction cycle. The reaction cycle is the time between stimulus and response. Something happens, you respond. And the shorter that cycle, the more reactive you are. Most people have very short reaction cycles. They respond almost instantly. Someone says something, they respond. Something unexpected happens, they react. And short reaction cycles lead to poor responses, because there's no time for analysis, no time for strategy, no time for controlled decision-making. Slowing the reaction cycle is one of the most powerful composure tools, because it creates space where cognitive control can operate. Space where you can choose your response instead of defaulting to automatic reaction. And that space doesn't have to be long. Even a few seconds changes the quality of your response dramatically. Here's how you train this. When something happens that triggers a response impulse, you pause deliberately for 3 seconds. You don't act. You don't speak. You just pause. And in those 3 seconds, you do 3 things. First, you notice what you're feeling. Not to judge it, just to identify it. I'm feeling defensive. I'm feeling anxious. I'm feeling frustrated. Second, you assess the situation, not deeply. Just a quick scan. What actually happened? What's the context? What's at stake? And third, you choose your response, not the first response that comes to mind. The best response, the one aligned with your goals. 3 seconds is not long. It's barely noticeable to others. But internally it's transformative because it shifts you from reactive mode to responsive mode. Reactive mode is automatic. Responsive mode is intentional. And intentional responses are almost always better calibrated than automatic ones. This practice requires discipline because your brain wants to react immediately. It wants to close the gap between stimulus and response as fast as possible. But you're training a different pattern, one where you control the gap, where you decide when to respond, not your impulses. Slowing the reaction cycle also reduces escalation in conflicts. For example, fast reactions escalate. Someone says something sharp. You respond sharply, they respond more sharply. The cycle accelerates, but if you pause before responding, you break the acceleration. You can respond without escalating. You can address the content without matching the intensity. And that pause often de-escalates the other person too, because escalation requires mutual participation. If you don't participate, it stops. Another benefit: slowing the cycle gives you access to more response options. When you react instantly, you're limited to your most automatic responses, the ones your brain defaults to under pressure. But when you pause, you have time to consider alternatives, different approaches, more strategic options. And those alternatives are often better than your default response. This practice also builds over time. The more you pause, the easier it becomes. Your brain starts to expect the pause. It becomes part of your response pattern. And eventually the pause doesn't feel like effort. It feels natural, like you're just taking a moment to think, which is exactly what you're doing. One challenge: in some situations, pausing feels socially awkward. In fast-paced conversations, for example, in situations where immediate response is expected. But even in these contexts, a brief pause is acceptable. It doesn't have to be 3 seconds. It can be 1, just enough to shift from pure reaction to controlled response. And most people won't notice. They'll just perceive you as thoughtful, measured, composed. The key is making the pause automatic, not something you have to remember to do, but something you do reflexively. And you build that automation through repetition. Every time you feel the impulse to react, you pause. Every time, no exceptions. And over weeks, the pause becomes your new default. You stop reacting instantly. You start responding deliberately. Slowing the reaction cycle is not passivity, it's precision. It's choosing your responses instead of letting them be chosen for you. And that choice is what separates reactive people from composed people. Chapter 5. Controlling Physiological Stress. Composure is not just psychological, it's physiological. Your body's stress responses directly affect your ability to think clearly. And if you can't control your body's reactions, you can't fully control your mind. When you're under pressure, your body activates, heart rate increases, breathing becomes shallow, muscles tense, blood flow redirects from your brain to your extremities. And all of this is designed to prepare you for physical action. But in psychological pressure, physical action is rarely appropriate. You need cognitive clarity, and these physiological responses interfere with that clarity. The solution is not eliminating the stress response. It's modulating it, keeping it within a range where you can still think clearly. Too little activation and you're sluggish. Too much and you're overwhelmed. The goal is controlled activation. Enough to stay alert, not so much that you lose cognitive function. The most direct tool for controlling physiological stress is breathing. Specifically, controlled exhalation. When you're stressed, your breathing becomes shallow and fast. This activates your sympathetic nervous system, which drives the stress response. But when you slow your breathing and extend your exhale, you activate your parasympathetic nervous system, which counteracts the stress response. Here's the technique. Breathe in through your nose for 4 counts. Hold for 2 counts. Breathe out through your mouth for 6 counts. The exhale is longer than the inhale, and that extended exhale is what signals your parasympathetic system. Do this 3 or 4 times, and you'll notice your heart rate slowing, your muscles relaxing, your mind clearing. This is not relaxation breathing. You're not trying to become fully calm. You're modulating, bringing your activation down from overwhelming to manageable. And you can do this anywhere. In meetings, before presentations, during conflicts. No one will notice, but you'll feel the shift. Another physiological tool: muscle tension release. When you're stressed, your muscles tense unconsciously, jaw, shoulders, hands, and that tension feeds back into your stress response, creating a loop. But you can interrupt the loop by consciously releasing tension. Focus on your jaw, relax it. Your shoulders, drop them. Your hands, unlench them. This sends a signal to your brain there's no threat. We don't need to stay braced, and your stress response moderates. A third tool: grounding. When stress responses activate, your attention narrows. You lose awareness of your body and your environment. You're trapped in your thoughts. Grounding brings you back. You focus on physical sensations, the feeling of your feet on the floor, the texture of the surface you're touching, the temperature of the air. This redirects your attention away from internal stress and toward external reality, and that shift reduces the intensity of the stress response. Heart rate variability is another control point. When you're calm, your heart rate varies naturally. It speeds up slightly on the inhale and slows slightly on the exhale. But under stress, that variability decreases. Your heart rate becomes rigid, and that rigidity signals your brain to maintain the stress response. You can increase variability by focusing on your breath, inhaling slowly, exhaling slowly, and your heart rate will begin to vary again, which signals your brain that the threat is decreasing. Physical movement also helps. Under stress, your body is primed for action. And if you don't move, that primed energy stays trapped, creating agitation. But if you move, even briefly, you discharge some of that energy. A short walk, stretching, even just standing and shifting your weight. This doesn't eliminate stress, but it releases the physical buildup. And that release makes psychological composure easier. Cold exposure is another tool, though less practical in most situations. Cold water on your face, holding ice, stepping outside into cold air. Cold triggers a physiological response called the dive reflex. It slows your heart rate, redirects blood flow, and interrupts stress activation. This is a more intense intervention, but in moments of acute stress, it's highly effective. The key principle: you cannot have full psychological composure without physiological control. Your body and mind are connected, and if your body is in full stress response, your mind cannot function optimally. So you train both. You train your thinking, and you train your physiological regulation. And when both are controlled, composure becomes sustainable, even under sustained pressure. Chapter 6: Cognitive Reframing in Real Time. Cognitive reframing is changing how you interpret a situation without changing the situation itself. It's seeing the same facts through a different lens, and that different lens changes your emotional response. Most stress under pressure comes not from the situation but from how you're interpreting it. You see the situation as threatening, as overwhelming, as a test of your worth, and those interpretations activate stress. But the same situation can be interpreted differently, as a challenge, as an opportunity, as information, and those interpretations produce different responses. Reframing is not positive thinking. It's not pretending the situation is better than it is. It's finding the interpretation that's both accurate and useful. Some interpretations are accurate but not useful. This could go badly is often accurate, but focusing on it increases anxiety without improving your response. Other interpretations are equally accurate and more useful. This is uncertain, but I've handled uncertainty before as accurate, and it reduces anxiety while maintaining realism. The skill is choosing the useful interpretation, not the one that feels most automatic, but the one that serves your composure and effectiveness. Here's how you do it in real time. When you notice yourself interpreting a situation in a way that increases stress, you pause and you ask, is there another way to see this that's equally true but less activating? For example, you're about to give a presentation. Your automatic interpretation: everyone will judge me. If I mess up, they'll think I'm incompetent. That interpretation is possible, but it's not certain, and it creates intense pressure. Alternative interpretation: they're here to hear information. My job is to deliver it clearly. Their evaluation is secondary. Both are reasonable, but the second reduces pressure. It refocuses you on the task instead of on judgment. Another example: you're in a conflict. Automatic interpretation: they're attacking me. I need to defend myself. That interpretation escalates. It frames the situation as combat. Alternative: they're frustrated and expressing it poorly. I can respond to the content without engaging the hostility. Same situation, different frame, different emotional response. Reframing also works for failure. Automatic interpretation: I failed. This means I'm not good enough. That interpretation is identity threatening. It creates shame and avoidance. Alternative, this didn't work. What can I learn from it? Same event, but the second frame treats it as information, not as identity. The key is speed. You need to reframe quickly before the automatic interpretation fully activates your stress response. This requires practice because automatic interpretations are fast. They feel like reality, not like interpretations. But they are interpretations, and you can choose different ones. One method: pre-framing. Before entering a high-pressure situation, you decide how you're going to interpret it. You choose the frame in advance. Then, when automatic interpretations arise, you have an alternative ready. You don't have to generate it in the moment. You just return to the frame you already chose. For example, before a difficult conversation, you decide this is a chance to clarify, not a battle. And during the conversation, when you start feeling defensive, you return to that frame. Pre-framing is easier than real-time reframing because you're choosing the frame when you're calm, not when you're activated. Another tool: evidence checking. When you notice a stress-inducing interpretation, you ask, what evidence do I have that this is true? Often you'll find that the interpretation is based on assumption, not evidence. They're judging me as an assumption. You don't know what they're thinking. And when you recognize it as assumption, the interpretation loses some of its power. It becomes one possibility among many, not a certainty. Reframing is not denial. You're not pretending difficult situations are easy. You're choosing how to hold them psychologically, because the same situation can be held as catastrophe or as challenge, as threat or as test, and how you hold it determines how you respond. Composed people are not people who never face difficult situations. They're people who frame difficult situations in ways that preserve their effectiveness. And that's a trainable skill. Chapter 7: Internal stability under external chaos. External chaos is inevitable. People panicking, rapid changes, conflicting information, urgent demands. And in that chaos, most people lose their internal stability. They react to the chaos. They match its intensity. They fragment. But composed people don't. They remain internally stable even when everything around them is unstable. This is not because they're unaffected. It's because they've trained themselves to maintain an internal reference point that doesn't move with external conditions. Internal stability means your psychological state is determined by your internal processes, not external events. You still respond to what's happening, but your core composure doesn't fluctuate with every change. Most people are externally referenced. Their state mirrors their environment. If the environment is calm, they're calm. If it's chaotic, they're chaotic. But internally stable people are internally referenced. They maintain their state independent of external conditions. The foundation of internal stability is self-monitoring. You track your own state, not obsessively, but consistently. You notice when you're becoming reactive, when your thoughts are speeding up, when your emotions are intensifying. And when you notice these shifts, you correct them. You slow down, you regulate, you return to baseline. This self-monitoring creates an internal feedback loop. External chaos tries to destabilize you. You notice the destabilization, you correct, you restabilize, and the more you practice this, the faster the correction happens, until it becomes almost automatic. Another component, mental anchoring. You establish a mental reference point that remains constant, a principle, a goal, a standard. And when chaos increases, you return to that anchor. You ask, what's my priority here? What's my standard? What am I trying to accomplish? That anchor keeps you oriented. It prevents you from being swept into reactive patterns. For example, in a chaotic meeting where everyone is talking over each other, your anchor might be, my goal is to communicate clearly, not to win the argument. And every time you feel pulled into the chaos, you return to that anchor. It refocuses you. It stabilizes you. Internal stability also requires emotional boundaries. You don't absorb other people's panic. You don't take on their stress. You can be empathetic. You can care. But you don't merge with their emotional state. This is a subtle but critical distinction. You're present with them, but you're not destabilized by them. One way to maintain this boundary: you view their panic as information, not contagion. They're stressed. That tells you something about their state, but it doesn't dictate your state. You can respond to their stress without becoming stressed yourself. Physical grounding also supports internal stability. When external chaos increases, you ground yourself physically, feet on the floor, weight in your seat, breath controlled. This creates a felt sense of stability. Your body is stable, and that physical stability supports psychological stability. Another practice, deliberate pacing. When everything around you is moving fast, you intentionally slow down, not to the point of ineffectiveness, but enough to maintain control. You speak more slowly, you move more deliberately, you think before responding. This pacing signals to your nervous system we're not in emergency mode. We're controlled, and that signal prevents you from being pulled into the chaos. Internal stability is not rigidity. You still adapt. You still respond to changing conditions. But your adaptation is controlled, not reactive. You change because you've chosen to, not because the chaos forced you to. The ultimate test of internal stability is sustained chaos. Not a brief, intense moment, but prolonged instability. And in sustained chaos, internal stability requires active maintenance. You can't just set it once. You have to re-establish it repeatedly. You notice when you're drifting, and you bring yourself back, again and again, until the chaos resolves or until you've adapted to operating within it. Most people cannot maintain internal stability under sustained pressure. They degrade over time. They become more reactive, more fragmented, but trained composure allows you to sustain, to maintain your internal reference point even when external conditions remain chaotic. And that sustained stability is what separates composed people from everyone else. Part of such a high-stakes application. Chapter 8. Conflict without emotional collapse. Conflict is one of the highest pressure psychological situations because it combines multiple stressors: threat to identity, social pressure, emotional activation, uncertainty about outcome, and under that combination, most people collapse emotionally. They become defensive, aggressive, they say things they regret, or they shut down entirely. But composed people navigate conflict without collapsing. They engage without being destabilized. They hold their position without escalating. The first principle: you separate the person from the position. Most conflicts feel personal, like they're attacking you. And when you interpret it that way, you become defensive. But most conflicts are about positions, not people. They disagree with your idea, your decision, your approach, not with you as a person. And when you separate these, the conflict becomes less threatening. You can defend your position without defending your identity. The second principle: you manage your physiological response before you engage verbally. If your heart is racing and your breath is shallow, your thinking is compromised. So before you respond, you regulate, slow breath, release tension, ground yourself. This takes seconds, but those seconds determine whether you respond effectively or creatively. The third principle: you respond to content, not to tone. In conflict, people often use aggressive or dismissive tones, and those tones trigger emotional reactions. But if you respond to the tone, you escalate. You're now in a fight about how they're speaking, not about the actual issue. Instead, you respond to the content. You address what they're saying, not how they're saying it. This de-escalates because you're not engaging the emotional layer. You're engaging the substantive layer. For example, someone says harshly, "This idea is completely impractical." Reactive response: you're always criticizing everything I suggest. Now you're in a personal conflict about criticism patterns. The original issue is lost. Composed response: what specifically makes it impractical? You're engaging the content. You're asking for clarification. You're staying focused. Another principle: you don't match intensity. If they're loud, you don't get louder. If they're aggressive, you don't get aggressive. Matching intensity escalates. It creates a feedback loop where both parties keep intensifying. But if you maintain lower intensity, you break the loop. They intensify, you stay calm, and often they de-intensify to match you. This requires discipline, because matching intensity feels natural. It feels like you're standing your ground. But standing your ground doesn't require matching intensity. It requires holding your position calmly. And calm resistance is stronger than intense resistance, because calm doesn't exhaust itself. You also avoid defensive language. Defensive language signals that you feel attacked, and signaling that reinforces the attack dynamic. Statements like "I was just trying to," or "I didn't mean to," or defensive. They're explanations born from feeling threatened. Instead, you state your position directly, without defensiveness. "This is my reasoning," instead of "I was just thinking that maybe." Direct statement. No apology, no defensiveness. Another tool: acknowledging their perspective before stating yours. This doesn't mean agreeing. It means showing that you've heard them. "I understand you see this as impractical. My perspective is that it's feasible if we adjust the timeline." You're not conceding, you're acknowledging. An acknowledgement reduces defensiveness on both sides. Conflict also requires clarity about what you're willing to concede and what you're not. If you enter conflict without knowing this, you'll make concessions creatively, just to reduce discomfort. But reactive concessions often lead to regret. You gave up something you shouldn't have, just to end the conflict. Instead, you decide beforehand, this is negotiable, this is not, and you hold that line calmly. The final principle: you know when to disengage. Not all conflicts are worth continuing. Some are unproductive. Some are circular, some are more about venting than about resolution. And in those cases, composed people disengage, not by storming out, but by calmly exiting. I don't think we're making progress here. Let's revisit this later. You're not giving up. You're recognizing that continuing is not useful, and you're choosing to stop. Conflict without emotional collapse is not about winning. It's about maintaining your composure and your effectiveness regardless of the other person's state. You can't control whether they collapse, but you can control whether you do. And that control is what makes you effective under pressure. Chapter 9. Public Pressure and Social Evaluation. Public pressure is pressure that comes from being observed and evaluated by multiple people simultaneously, and it's one of the most intense forms of psychological stress. The physiological response to public speaking, for example, rivals the response to physical danger. Heart rate can reach levels seen in combat. Cortisol spikes dramatically. And this happens because your brain perceives social evaluation as existential threat. In ancestral environments, group rejection could mean death, and your brain still responds as if that's true. The first tool for handling public pressure: reframing observation. Instead of seeing the audience as judges, see them as recipients of information. They're not there to evaluate you personally. They're there to receive what you're communicating, and you're there to deliver it. This shift reduces the threat level. You're not being judged. You're performing a function. The second tool: narrowing focus. Under public pressure, your attention wants to scatter. You're aware of every person, every expression, every potential judgment. But that scattered attention overwhelms you. You can't focus on your content because you're monitoring reactions. Instead, you narrow your focus to one person, to your material, to the next sentence. You're not ignoring the audience. You're just not trying to track everyone simultaneously. The third tool: pre-exposure. The more you expose yourself to public pressure in low-stakes situations, the less intense it becomes in high-stakes situations. Your brain habituates. The first time you present, your stress response is maximal. The 10th time, it's significantly lower. The 100th time, it's manageable. So you seek out low-stakes public speaking. You volunteer. You practice. You expose yourself gradually, and over time, your brain stops treating it as life-threatening. Another tool: preparation. The more prepared you are, the lower your uncertainty, and lower uncertainty means lower threat response. But preparation doesn't mean memorizing. Memorization increases pressure because now you're worried about forgetting. Instead, preparation means deep familiarity with your material. You know it well enough that you can speak about it naturally, without needing to recall specific words. Physical anchoring also helps. You choose a physical cue that signals composure. Feet grounded, hands at your sides, upright posture, and you practice that physical state until it's associated with calm. Then, when you're in public pressure, you return to that physical state, and it helps activate the associated psychological state. Another principle: you don't try to eliminate nervousness. Trying to eliminate it increases it, because now you're nervous about being nervous. Instead, you reframe nervousness as activation. Your body is preparing you. Adrenaline is not panic, it's energy. And you can use that energy. This reframing has been shown to improve performance. People who reframe anxiety as excitement perform better than people who try to suppress it. You also manage your self-talk under public pressure. Negative self-talk intensifies. I'm going to mess this up. They're going to judge me. I shouldn't be this nervous. But that self-talk is predictive. You're priming yourself for poor performance. Instead, you use neutral or constructive self-talk. I'm prepared. I know this material. I've done this before. Not false confidence. Just statements that don't undermine you. Visualization is another tool. Before the public event, you visualize yourself performing well, not perfectly, just competently, calmly. You visualize the environment, the people, the beginning, the middle, the end, all of it going reasonably well. This mental rehearsal primes your brain. It's already experienced a version of the event. So when the real event happens, it feels more familiar. And familiarity reduces threat. During the event, you focus on execution, not on evaluation. You're not thinking about how you're doing. You're just doing. This is called process focus. And it's more effective than outcome focus. Because outcome focus creates pressure. Process focus creates engagement. Finally, you accept imperfection. Public performance will not be perfect. You'll stumble. You'll misspeak. You'll have moments of awkwardness. And that's fine. Perfection is not the standard. Effectiveness is. And effectiveness means communicating clearly despite imperfection, not avoiding all mistakes, but recovering from them without collapsing. Public pressure is intense, but it's trainable. The more you experience it, the more you train your response, the less destabilizing it becomes, until you can stand in front of people and remain internally composed. Not unaffected, but controlled. Chapter 10. Becoming the calmest person in the room. Becoming the calmest person in the room is not about personality. It's about trained response patterns. It's about having built the habits that allow you to remain composed when others are not. And that composure is visible. People notice, they feel it, and they respond to it. When everyone is panicking and you're calm, you become the reference point. People look to you. They stabilize around you. Not because you're telling them to calm down, but because your composure is contagious. The foundation is everything you've trained: slowing your reaction cycle, controlling your physiology, reframing situations, maintaining internal stability. All of these become automatic. You don't have to think about them. Your system defaults to them. And that automation is what makes you reliably calm. It's not effort, it's pattern. But there's also an identity component. You see yourself as someone who remains composed. And that self-perception shapes your behavior. You're not trying to be calm. You are calm. Because that's who you've trained yourself to be. And that identity is reinforced every time you stay composed in situations where others don't. Being the calmest person also means you don't absorb others' panic. You're in the room with stressed people, but their stress doesn't transfer to you. You recognize it, you respond to it, but you don't take it on. This requires clear psychological boundaries. Their state is theirs. Your state is yours. Another aspect: you don't fill silence to ease others' discomfort. When there's tension in the room, most people talk. They try to smooth things over. They fill the uncomfortable space. But you're comfortable with tension. You let it exist. And often that composure forces others to sit with the tension too, which leads to better resolutions than premature smoothing. You also speak less than others because you don't need to prove your competence through volume of speech. You speak when you have something substantive to add, and that restraint makes your words carry more weight. People listen when you speak because you don't speak unnecessarily. Being the calmest also means you're the least emotionally reactive. Someone says something provocative, others react. You don't, not because you're unaffected, but because you've chosen not to react. You've assessed it, decided it's not worth reacting to, and moved on. And that non-greetivity is powerful. It shows control, and people respect control. Another element, you make decisions when others are frozen. High-pressure situations often create decision paralysis. People don't want to commit because they're afraid of being wrong. But you're willing to decide, not recklessly, but decisively. You assess, you choose, you commit. And that decisiveness becomes leadership, not formal leadership, functional leadership. People follow because you're moving when they're stuck. You also remain consistent. Your composure doesn't fluctuate based on external conditions. You're calm in chaos, calm in conflict, calm under scrutiny. That consistency builds trust. People know what to expect from you, and predictability under pressure is rare and valuable. Being the calmest person is not about superiority. It's about stability. You're not better than others. You're just more controlled, and that control creates an anchor for the group. They may not consciously recognize it, but they feel it. The final point: this is not a performance. You're not faking calm. You've trained it. It's genuine, and genuine composure is unmistakable. It has a quality that performance doesn't. A groundedness, a solidity. And people respond to that authenticity. They trust it. They stabilize around it. Becoming the calmest person in the room is the culmination of all your training. It's the external manifestation of internal discipline. And once you've built it, it becomes part of who you are. Not something you try to do, just who you are. Closing. Calm under pressure is not luck, it is rehearsal. You've learned the mechanisms that create pressure, why your brain escalates threat, how emotional hijacking works, what social pressure does to your thinking. You've learned the training methods, how to slow your reactions, how to control your physiology, how to reframe in real time, how to maintain internal stability when external conditions are chaotic. And you've learned the applications, how to navigate conflict without collapse, how to handle public evaluation, how to become the calmest person in the room. This knowledge is not theoretical, it's actionable, and it becomes effective through practice. Not practice when things are easy, practice when things are hard, when you're actually under pressure, when composure actually costs something. That's where the training solidifies. That's where patterns become automatic. Composure under pressure is not a destination. It's a practice, a continuous practice. You will still feel pressure. You will still have moments where you're less composed than you'd like, where you react before you pause, where your physiology overwhelms your cognition. And that's expected. You're not building perfection. You're building capacity. The measure of progress is not whether you feel pressure. It's how you respond to it, how quickly you notice, how effectively you regulate, how soon you recover, and over time. Those metrics improve. You notice faster. You regulate more effectively. You recover more quickly, until pressure becomes something you navigate skillfully, not something that destabilizes you. This training also changes how others perceive you. They see someone who doesn't panic, who thinks clearly when they're reacting, who makes decisions when they're frozen. And that perception creates opportunities. People want composed people on their teams, in their organizations, in high-stakes situations, because they know composed people perform when it matters. But the deeper value is internal. It's knowing that you can trust yourself under pressure, that you won't collapse, that you won't be controlled by panic. That internal trust is worth more than any external perception. Train it every day, in small moments and large ones. Notice when you're reactive, pause, regulate, reframe. Notice when others are panicking, maintain your stability. Don't absorb their state. Notice when pressure increases. Don't match it. Control your response. And over time, composure becomes who you are. Not something you perform, not something you strive for, just who you are. Calm under pressure is not luck, it is rehearsal. Train it, use it, become it. End of audiobook.